Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yep. Hello, my name's Eric Wishart. I'm the first Vice President of the FCC, and I'm delighted to welcome you today for our first in-person FCC event since July. We're a slightly smaller but very high quality group, I can say, because we're observing the rules, which means we should have 6 people per table. So welcome, and we've been waiting for this event for quite a long time because we decided that we should hold off on our book events until the authors can actually be present. I think people like to meet the author, sign the book, and your book's on sale, Antony,
yes,
right?
Yes.
City on Fire, more relevant than ever. So we're going to have a series of events. Next Thursday, we're going to have Jake Vanderkamp, who you probably know quite well, talking about the rise and fall of the Hang Seng Index. And I think our capacity at the moment is about 60. So if you would like to come, I think sign up soon. I think we're heading towards full capacity. So these events are going to be pretty quick sellouts. We're continuing our Zoom events as well, which has given us a great international series of events over the summer. John Bolton, Gary Kasparov, Noam Chomsky, which has got like how many hits, Genevieve, on social media? More than 100,000, or so the Zoom events will continue as well. We're not going to stop so we can do in person. So talking about today, Antony, City on Fire. City is still on fire. Antony speaks fluent Mandarin, which gives him obviously a great insight that a lot of people who comment on China don't have. And he's a lawyer qualified in Britain, Hong Kong, and Australia, which is pretty distinguished. But he's also a frequent commentator about Hong Kong politics on the BBC. He's written for The Guardian, so we couldn't get a more distinguished and better time speaker than Antony today, and who better to do it? And I was reading your live blog yesterday on the events, Jodi Schneider, our president, and who's a senior international correspondent for Bloomberg. Okay, so thank you. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Eric. Well, let me first add my voice to Eric's to say that how we are so pleased to finally be having this event. I think we first talked to you about doing it in March, and that got postponed. We thought we'd do it this summer, and that got postponed, but here we are. So even though we're masked and spaced, it's great to do this in person, and so thanks to Antony for his patience and to the audience for theirs as well. Secondly, let me congratulate you on the reviews of City on Fire. They appear to be, on the whole, positive. One from the SCMP in March. City on Fire lives up to its publisher's promise of providing an essential guide to the Hong Kong protests, and calls you a clear-eyed observer of the city's politics. So congratulations. Before we discuss the themes and insights in the books, I'd like to talk to you about the writing process. So you kind of wrote your book while we could all watch, both in your procrastinations, as I think you called them, in emails and on Twitter, were your force. You wrote as you were out there observing and talking to people. Was that a kind of conscious decision, or did you just start writing and think, hey, I'm gonna do, as long as I'm out here, I might as well be tweeting and talking to my readers in advance?
It began unconsciously. I mean, when all the events kicked off in June of last year, I was naturally interested, having written a first shorter book about Hong Kong protests called City of Protest, which had come out after the Umbrella Movement in 2017. So when the events kicked off middle of last year, I was naturally interested in and following events and tweeting about them and writing pieces for various outlets. And I began sort of also just keeping a little running journal of events that were happening on my phone as I was out on the ground day in, day out. And as we got sort of a month or so into the protest, certainly after the Legco break-in on 1st of July, it was clear that this was something big and was going to be important. And so I started being a bit more diligent about my note-taking, expecting that I'd have to, in some way, respond to the events, either with an update of my first book or what eventually became a complete new book. And what was actually quite interesting was when I first approached publishers and agents around that time, sort of late July, early August, about a book on Hong Kong, they sort of all said, well, Hong Kong, it's interesting, but it's kind of niche. Could you, maybe make it more of part of a bigger China story? That'd be more interesting. And sort of, luckily, I found a publisher who was interested in the Hong Kong story, and of course, at this point in time, we've got sort of almost everyone's putting out a Hong Kong book now, and Hong Kong's sort of no longer a niche topic as a result of the events of last year. But certainly after I'd had got the deal to write the book, which was in around October time, late September, early October, then I sort of had began to more consciously make everything a continuous production pipeline from tweet into either into tweet thread into either eventually a byline piece or an installment of my newsletter, and then that eventually fed into the chapters of the book, and so it all came in one continuous production pipeline, as it were. So, yeah.
Did you have to go back and rework? Because obviously what started happening in June and July was very different than what we saw, at PolyU and as things happened after that.
Yeah, so I essentially all that preparatory work was sort of note-taking, and I didn't actually sit down to start writing the book until the beginning of December, after the the district council elections had happened. And at that point, I had a deadline to deliver the manuscript by Christmas, so I sort of had 3 weeks to write the book. And so then I had to sort of figure out how to put all the material that I had together. And so I decided there were three broad themes, or three broad areas I needed the book to cover. I needed to cover the events of last year, primarily because my publisher had promised a definitive account of the protests, so I felt obliged to write one. Secondly, I wanted the historical context, so sort of touching upon the long history of political protest in Hong Kong and contextualizing the events of last year into that timeline and into that history. And then thirdly, sort of thematic ideas, either analyzing political aspects of the protests or cultural aspects. And so I began to sort of list out these things and was writing them on different color-coded post-it notes, so one color for each of those three themes, and sort of lay the events of last year up on the wall in post-it notes, and then sort of slotted the other bits around it in between. And having done that, I then had a plan for the book, and also unconsciously created my own little mini Lenin wall on my study door. And then from then I could just write through, following the plan that had sort of plugging in all the pieces. And that's actually when Twitter became really helpful as a journal and as a visual journal, because obviously I'm posting photographs and video as well as text. And so I could, when I was writing about a particular day, go back to that day and look at the photos and videos that I tweeted, to be able to get more of a more color into the descriptions, because I remind myself of the sights and the sounds and the feelings of being there, as well as the text. So, yeah.
One more about the writing and the process before we get on to the book itself. The tear gas prologue is an interesting approach. Even though tear gassing had been so widely covered in the media, how did you decide to start there? Was it because it was emblematic of the Hong Kong protests?
Yeah, I think just for me, it just felt so central to the experience of last year. Anyone who had been out there on the streets in the protests would have experienced it, and it's a very visceral experience. It's not something that you forget. And so I felt that it was both central to the experience and also thematically important in many ways. It was almost symbolic of the relationship between the government and the people, and a really interesting way to sort of wrap that up and summarize it. And the ideas of the solidarity among the people that grew out of it as well. So I just thought it was a good way both to immerse people in the experience of what it was like being on the streets of Hong Kong last year, and also to start to introduce some of the themes that came out of it.
Thank you. Now let's talk about the book itself and its takeaways. In 20 chapters, and I have the book here, so a little plug for the book, which you can get over there. You take us through the initial marches, then the tear gassing, the use of water cannons by police, and the violence in the streets. You write of the storming of Prince Edward subway station last August and the siege of Chinese U and Paoli U in Hong Kong. A year out from most of this, what sticks out most in your mind? What are the lessons you think? A year, and we'll talk about this week and things that and NSL and all that. But just looking back now, what really sticks out to you as the message of the book?
I think to me the main the main significance of the protests last year, and I suppose the main message I was hoping to get across, was the role that the protests had in nation building in Hong Kong. That this idea that, and to be very clear, I'm not talking about Hong Kong independence here or sort of an independent Hong Kong nation or nation state, but the idea of a Hong Kong people. And the idea that there are nations of people within other nations, as there are many places around the world, the Quebecois in Canada, the Catalans in Spain, the Kurds in Turkey and Iran. This idea that there could be a Hong Kong nation, and that seemed to be what a lot of the essence of the protests were driving at, and then a lot of the phenomena that built up around the protests, from the artwork to the anthems, the songs, to the slogans and the way that people rallied around the slogans. It seemed that this whole movement ultimately was building up this idea of a unique Hong Kong identity and a unique Hong Kong nation that was struggling in some way for greater autonomy within the state of the PRC. So that's sort of, I think, the big takeaway from last year.
A year out from most of this, what lessons do you think we learned about the protests? What about the tactics? And some have said that books like yours may have glorified the use of violence by the protesters and some of the tactics that had led us down a road to where we might be now. What would you say to them?
Look, I'm not seeking to glorify the violence, and I don't think I did. But I think the point I was trying to get at was that so many people in Hong Kong accepted it, and I think what I was really trying to do was to understand why. Why was it that time and again, when the government expected that the protesters had gone too far and they would get pushback from the community, or they would begin to lose support from the community, it didn't happen. And even after the most violent week that occurred exactly a week ago this week, leading up to the siege of Polytechnic University and all the events around that, even after that kind of apex of violence, a week or two later, some 60% of the population still came out and voted in support, essentially in support of the protests and those broad principles. And so it was just really interesting to me to understand why. And as part of trying to understand why, trying to understand what might be some of the reasons that both led to the violence and might have in some of people's minds justified it, or at least might not have led them to be as repulsed by it as they might have been. So that, that's at least my intention. I wasn't intending to take a particular stand one way or the other, but just to try to understand how this came about, because I think it was certainly a surprise to the government, who thought there'd be this great silent minority who would speak out against the violence, and probably in some ways a surprise to supporters and observers of the movement as well, that people thought, well, maybe other people will be unhappy about this, but I'll still continue to support them. But it turned out that support was more common than not. So that's the way what I was trying to understand through writing about the violence and those aspects of it. But sorry, was there the first half of your question that I?
A little bit about What about the tactics? What have we learned from the tactics? That, there was a lot that was learned after Umbrella that people say they used last year. What do you think that what people will remember will it be the leaderless nature?
Yeah, I mean, the tactics were fascinating. It was fascinating to see them developing often day by day or hour by hour on the ground. And clearly many of them were a response to what was seen as failures of the umbrella movement, whether that was overemphasis on particular leaders during the umbrella movement, which led to a leaderless approach this time, the sort of internal disputes during the umbrella movement, which led to this no splitting principle, and then down to this idea of being water, that occupations didn't work during the umbrella movement, so we'll switch to this very mobile pop-up style of protest. So all of these and many other tactics were responses to the umbrella movement and developed and built on previous protest movements. And I think what's been really interesting now, obviously, is to see them being used elsewhere, and in particular in Thailand over the last several weeks. Some of that imagery, it looks like it came from Hong Kong last year. The hard hats, the umbrellas, the blue water cannons. I mean, all those things. It's really quite remarkable. And not only that, it seems that the Thailand protesters have very consciously been learning from Hong Kong and borrowing those tactics, but also that the two movements have been providing mutual solidarity and support and creating messages of support for each other online, and creating the so-called milk tea alliance, but a very real sense of solidarity amongst these across these protest movements. And they're not the only ones. The tactics were also borrowed by Extinction Rebellion protesters in the UK and Australia, Catalan protesters in Spain as well. And so, I mean, it's a really neat phrase that I don't know who coined it, but calling Hong Kong a sort of a Silicon Valley of protest, which I thought was a great way of putting it. That it sort of was this little crucible in which all these different tactics were sort of formed and have now been disseminated throughout the world. Oh, and of course, Black Lives Matter as well. It's been a very significant borrowing of tactics from Hong Kong in many of the Black Lives Matter protests in Portland and elsewhere. So it's a real legacy of the protest movement, and something that the Hong Kong government always likes to talk about hubs and Hong Kong being an innovation hub. Well, it's certainly one of the ways in which Hong Kong's been an innovation hub, I would argue, perhaps most successfully. So.
I like that innovation hub. I don't know that the government is going to be touting that, however. But the other night we hosted in a Zoom event here at the club, Kurt Tong, who until last year was the Consul General for the U.S. in Hong Kong and Macau. And he was here much during the tumult of the protesters, certainly at the beginning. And reflecting on his time here, he wondered if the protests may have gone too far and inadvertently led to passage or imposition of the national security law in Hong Kong, saying that if things had stopped after that first two peaceful protests, that might have given the Hong Kong government time to sort of digest, think about the extradition policy, and maybe there could have been a different outcome. What do you think about that? From your discussions and all the research you've done from your book, was this an inevitable outcome, and the coronavirus outbreak the opportunity to impose this? Or do you think there may have been, like Kurt Tong said, there may have been an opportunity that there was to come up with something else?
Well, I would agree to a certain extent that yes, the national security law is the inevitable outcome of all of the events of last year. Last year was certainly the most open defiance of Communist Party rule on Chinese soil, at least since 1989, if not since 1949. I mean, 1989 in many ways wasn't looking to overturn the Communist Party rule. It had various demands, but last year you saw slogans such as "Heaven destroy the Communist Party" on the streets of Hong Kong. And so in some ways the national security law is an inevitable reaction to that. But I would not go as far as sort of victim blaming the Hong Kong protests for provoking that, because just as much as you might say they went too far, I would say the national security law is an overreaction to a problem that certainly doesn't exist in the form that Beijing seems to think it exists in. But look, if you want to think about opportunities or potential turning points where things might have been different, the first one would have come on the night of 9th of June last year, after 1 million people marched on the street, where any sensible leader would have surely thought, let's make a public statement saying we'll pause and reconsider and take this back to the drawing board. Whereas Carrie Lam basically said, good to see you all marching, we're going to go ahead with the bill on Thursday, or on Wednesday rather. So sort of giving a gigantic middle finger to much of the city. So that was the first opportunity that was lost. The second opportunity, a week later, after 2 million people had come out onto the street, she could have said definitively, yes, we will withdraw the bill and this is the end of it. And notwithstanding there'd already been some intervening additional demands from the police behaviour on Wednesday, and she should also have made some conciliatory or mollifying statements in that direction, but again, she failed to take the opportunity. And that, I think, began this cycle that really persisted through to the end of the year of protesters pushing, the government not responding or not engaging, or only responding and engaging too late when events had already overtaken them. And then very quickly, with the government effectively abdicating their role of leadership, leaving everything in the hands of police, who had only law and order tools to manage what was fundamentally a political problem, not a law and order problem. And that led to this inevitable escalating cycle of violence, on both sides, without the government intervening or engaging in any way to try and unwind it. And so that led us finally to the end of the year, when it was sort of I think the district council election certainly helped to diffuse tensions, and then followed by the coronavirus to definitively stop gatherings on the street, which then led to the pause. And that pause was another opportunity, really, for the government and for Beijing to think about how to address some of the concerns in the community. Things like the IPCC report, which came out earlier this year, and again was really unsatisfying, I think, for many members of the community. And so then sort of the sledgehammer of the national security law in response to all of that, you could say it was inevitable, given the threat that the Communist Party felt, that the defiance to their rule that was shown in Hong Kong. But it certainly seems like an overreaction to me, and just the latest in a whole series of missed opportunities. So.
What about the leaderless nature of the protests? Widely touted, and as you mentioned, a kind of reaction to the umbrella movement and some of the things they wish they hadn't done during umbrella. But did that make it also more difficult for there to be actual negotiations or talks or any kind of engagement between the sides that could have maybe mollified things?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fair point that there may have been no one for the government to negotiate with, even if they wanted to negotiate. But certainly the establishment, pan-democrat politicians, even though protesters and protest leaders would say, they're not the boss of me, we don't sort of take instructions from them, and they very quickly sort of disclaim any leadership role in the movement, they could form a helpful interlocutor. At least the government could speak to them, and they could, with the government, negotiate some kind of position that they could then try to get buy-in from the community. So that would have been one channel. The other channel was, of course, Carrie Lam's famous platform for dialogue, and she had that one event down at the Queen Elizabeth Stadium in Wan Chai, promising it was going to be one of an ongoing series of sessions where she'd engage with the community and listen to what people said, and I think that was the only one. And so, I mean, on the one hand, the government can say, well, there's no one for us to talk to, but they hardly made any effort to find anyone to speak to either. So yeah, but I do think that the pan-democrat politicians could have played a key role there if there was any interest from the government.
Well, so let's move to the events of this week. As we sit here, the remaining members of the opposition and LegCo are working on their resignation statements, and 4 have already been ousted, disqualified under a new resolution passed by China's top legislative body, allowing for the disqualification of any Hong Kong lawmakers who aren't deemed sufficiently loyal or patriotic. You've been quoted, including by my news organization, thank you, as saying this effectively ends meaningful opposition in Hong Kong and accelerates the integration of Hong Kong into the mainland party state. Could you elaborate further? We've been hearing since the summer with the imposition of the national security law that it's the effective end of one-party, two systems. With a one-party legislature, is it effective control by Beijing now?
Yes, I mean, it's no secret that the legislature was always biased in favor of Beijing. The functional constituency system and the way the system was set up is designed that Beijing ultimately pulls the strings or has control over the legislature. But the Pan Democrats had been quite an effective opposition party. Now, as there were constraints placed on their power or their role, they resorted to more extreme means, such as the filibustering and the protests inside the chamber. But with this election, or the election that should have happened in September, there was a real chance that they were going to get a meaningful share of the votes and a meaningful block of seats in that chamber. I would have been surprised if they actually got a majority, but they would have got pretty close, I think. And that clearly frightened Beijing. When it comes down to, at least Beijing under the current administration, they really don't accept any kind of check or balance on their power, on party power and party control. And that is obviously fundamentally at odds with the idea of one country, two systems and autonomy for Hong Kong. From the party's point of view, the party has to be in complete control of everything that happens in Hong Kong. And of course, they're already in charge of the executive, and they control the election of the chief executive, and the government, especially after the events of the last year, is now entirely answerable to Beijing, if not sort of doing nothing other than what Beijing instructs them to do. But the legislator had been this sort of thorn in their side. And so it seems that the decision is now being made to bring the legislature under control, so that it's no longer an effective check and balance on government power, through disqualifying candidates, through, it seems, somehow opening up the voting system to Hong Kong resident voters in Guangdong, with perhaps in the mainland, with perhaps the idea that can help favor the pro-Beijing parties, and now by just outright kicking legislators out, with the ultimate aim that the legislature is just a mainland-style sort of consideration body, like a People's Congress, rather than a genuine parliament. And so I think that's sort of where all this is coming from, and what's driving the decisions. The bigger concern, of course, is there is one branch of the government left, the judiciary, and they are the one thing that is genuinely a constraint on government power. And there's been a lot of discussion, of course, about pressures on the judiciary and threats to the independence of Hong Kong's judiciary, and I think that's obviously something we're all going to have to keep watching and be vigilant to, because it's certainly going to be the next to be targeted. But yeah, so the events of this week are not surprising. It doesn't make them any less dispiriting. I think particularly concerning was the fact that there was no real legal basis cited for what the NPC did. So, technically, the NPC can only intervene in Hong Kong in two ways. They can interpret the basic law, or they can legislate for Hong Kong in the way they did with the national security law. And so this time around, they just sort of cited a basket full of laws, sort of in accordance with the relevant provisions of the Constitution, the Basic Law, the National Security Law, the interpretation of Article 104 of the Basic Law. We hereby make this decision. It sort of reminded me of, I don't know if any of you have seen an Australian movie called The Castle, where there's a lawyer before the High Court of sort of a bush lawyer before the High Court of Australia, who says, it's just the Constitution, it's Mabo, it's the vibe, it's just in the vibe. So that's sort of what the NPC was saying. It's just the vibe. But also that's just lazy lawmaking, because they could have made a definitive interpretation, or they could have made an interpretation of the national security law, for example, which they have the power to do, but they didn't. It was just a sheer exercise of state power. In a way, that itself is sort of a signal that the NPC is not pretending to be constrained by or operating under a proper framework of Hong Kong's rule of law. They are just exercising so-called comprehensive control, comprehensive jurisdiction over Hong Kong, and making decisions accordingly. And so that, in a way, is just as alarming as the fact that they kicked out 4 legislators, without any real proper procedure.
What about the judiciary? As a lawyer here, what is your thinking? Is there going to be is that the last line of defense, and will that hold for long?
It certainly appears to be the last line of defense. And they've been doing an admirable job so far. I think the Chief Justice has been very outspoken and very strong on this issue. I think it's his personal power of persuasion and his personal authority and his personal integrity that has ensured that all the foreign judges have stayed on the Court of Final Appeal. We've had one foreign judge, one of the Australian judges, resigned, but none of the others have. And having seen on several occasions just the personal interaction between the Chief Judge and some of the other the Chief Justice and some of the other foreign judges when they come to visit, there's clearly a lot of respect and affection for the Chief Justice. And I think his personal authority and integrity has been vital in maintaining the independence and integrity of Hong Kong's judiciary. But his term ends at the end of this year. We have a new Chief Justice coming in, and of course constantly new judges coming up through the pipeline. And the way that those judicial promotion decisions are made and the kind of people that are getting promoted will be important to watch. But clearly, already the judiciary is coming under criticism through the pro-Beijing press, through statements directly from Beijing, often from the Hong Kong Macau Affairs Office or the Liaison Office, demanding that judges carry out their patriotic duty in upholding the law. And I think these pressures will continue. And you can't help feeling that inevitably, consciously or subconsciously, they're going to weigh on the minds of the judges and influence their behavior. For example, when they're thinking about their own career progression. If you're a young, ambitious judge who wants to sort of become a Court of Appeal judge or eventually become a Court of Final Appeal judge, these things, consciously or unconsciously, are going to be at the back of your mind. And of course, they also want to be careful not to provoke Beijing into circumscribing their power even further. And so I think there are going to be also inevitable calculations involved there as well. But yes, the judiciary is the last line and the thing that distinguishes Hong Kong from the rest of China, something that the Hong Kong government always talks about as being one of the advantages of investing in and doing business in Hong Kong as opposed to elsewhere. And as that gradually erodes, it's going to be very damaging, I think, to Hong Kong and its status. Sorry, I can't be more optimistic.
Well, I'm going to ask you a couple just quick questions about the book and books, and then we're going to turn to the audience. I'm sure there's lots of questions. So are you planning an update? So much has happened. Or maybe even some more procrastinations, but is there another book in all this?
It does look, certainly if enough copies are sold that there's going to be a reprint, I'd certainly write an afterword to update what had happened since then. When I finished writing it, I finished on I had a slightly optimistic sense that Hong Kong was going perhaps in an interesting direction. Obviously, there's much less optimism now. I don't think a whole book about all the terrible things that have happened in Hong Kong would make very pleasant reading. I'm not sure who'd want to read a book like that. But look, procrastinations are always a possibility, especially if I've got more important work to do. But because writing procrastinations would be quite an interesting thing to do right now, I've been putting that off by doing other things. So
procrastinating and procrastination.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah. But no, look, certainly I'll keep writing and speaking about Hong Kong, and we'll see how things develop. I do think the story's not over. Absolutely. When the way that the feeling, that sort of the atmosphere that I feel at the moment is really very similar to what it was at the end of the Umbrella Movement. I feel that after the Umbrella Movement finished, people felt, we gave it our all. We camped on the street for months. The government just stonewalled and ignored us, and we've gotten nowhere. And should we just give up? And there was this real sense of despair. And at that time when my first book came out, City of Protest, in 2017, things had been pretty quiet for a few years, and people would sort of quip, well, is Hong Kong still a city of protest? Look, nothing's happening anymore. But of course, it did, and all the underlying factors were there for it to recur. And I feel that, again, it's quiet for the moment, and people are feeling dispirited. But the 2-3 million people who marched on the streets and voted in the elections last year are all still here, or most of them are still here. And certainly Beijing hasn't been doing anything to win over their hearts and minds. If anything, the way they feel is even more entrenched as a result of what's happened since then. And I don't think we're going to see a return to the same kinds of protests on the street that we saw last year, but dissent will continue to exist here, and it will try and find the gaps and find ways to express itself as it has under authoritarian regimes around the world. So I don't think the story is over. And it will be interesting to see how the Hong Kong story continues to develop, and even how I could write another chapter of it, but let's see, wait a few more years and see.
And we've been asking everyone this on our Zoom calls all summer and fall and now in person. So what are you reading? What would you recommend besides your book? But is there anything you recommend, either on politics or maybe a novel? What should people be buying for gifts?
That's a good question. I've been reading, well, this is a bit esoteric. I've been reading a book about the Australian author George Johnson and his partner Charmian Clift, and the years they lived on the Greek island of Hydra with Leonard Cohen and some other people, called Half the Perfect World, which is about sort of a bohemian artist living on Greek islands in the 1950s and 1960s, which is an interesting book. I'm also looking forward to starting Ellie Smith's Summer, which is the final installment of her Seasons Quartet, which has been a wonderful series of books. She's released one a year for the last 4 years, one for each season. Very current, writing about events that have literally happened in the course of the last year in novel form about Brexit and climate change and all these kinds of things, which has been a really great series. So I'm just about to start that, and I've also read
It's on my bedside table too.
That's right. And also an interesting sci-fi book. I sort of tend to read sort of one interesting sci-fi book a year. I'm not like a big science fiction fan, but I heard a recommendation and picked up this one, which is a book called Children of Time by a guy called Adrian Tchaikovsky, which is on the premise that some millennia into the future, the remnants of the human race sort of go out in search of a new colony, and it's interesting. It's too complex to explain all the ins and outs of it, but it plays with the idea of time and God and super intelligent spiders. So it's quite an interesting book. So yeah.
All right, super intelligent spiders. So thank you, and thank you for those recommendations. We're going to add them to our book list that we keep on our site. So now we have about 15 minutes or so to take questions. I will call on people, and microphones will come around. And if you could identify yourself and your organization, or affiliation, and remember this is being live streamed on Facebook and will be. I'm sorry? I don't think so. Yeah, as long as you're, if you're up here, we have to. But this is also, it will go out on YouTube later as well for posterity. So ask really good questions. So some questions, yeah, right here in front.
Anthony, hi. Back to the protesters.
Could you identify yourself?
I'm sorry,
please?
Joshua Zimmerman. Back to the protesters. Was there other consideration of following more of a sort of classic Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King passive resistance, civil disobedience strategy? They seem like they may have given up some moral high ground with the way that it unfolded.
Yeah, I mean, I think that those were the ideals that Benny Tai was aspiring to, or at least looking towards, and that inspired his Occupy Central movement in 2014. And I think that by the time we got to last year, a lot of, in particular, the young protesters had lost patience with that idea, and I think felt that this was the kind of regime that wouldn't be responsive to those sorts of those sorts of strategies. A complicated topic, but I think in the end, in the case of last year, it was the young protesters who, as they wrote on the walls of the Legco chamber, it was you who taught me that peaceful protest doesn't work. They felt, I think, provoked into taking the path that they took. But yeah, certainly the long game and the wise game may well have been to follow that sort of peaceful civil disobedience path, but events didn't transpire that way. But yeah, I think certainly part of that was a reaction to Benny Tyre and the failure of the umbrella movement.
Yeah, Edith.
Hi, Edith Terry, writer. You've described the protest movement as an identity movement. Now, in my mind, a protest movement and an identity movement are two different things. A protest movement can be inclusive and it's built around ideas. So I wonder if you could explore that a little bit more. And as an identity movement, what is the identity that is being put forward and may outlast this particular phase?
Yes, this is certainly one that morphed into the other. I mean, it began as a protest movement with a very clear single issue, right, to stop the extradition bill. That quickly morphed into a protest movement with several issues, sort of 5 demands, and then over time it gathered this idea of being an identity movement around it. I mean, the thing, just to, I guess, to explain a bit why I think that the identity aspect of it was so important. I mean, other than the obvious things of the slogans and the Gong Fu Heng Gong slogan and the artwork and the songs and so on. I mean, I can point to a very particular moment in Yuen Long on one of the anniversaries, the monthly anniversaries of the 21st July Yuen Long attacks, standing in the Yoho Mall in Yuen Long with thousands of protesters all around the atrium, singing the Glory to Hong Kong song. And if you witnessed that, I'm sure many of the people here would have been there and witnessed that. But you see the way that they stand to attention and sing that song with their hands on their hearts and the look in their eyes. You can feel the emotion in the room. It's a very powerful moment, and there's clearly something going on there. It's not just about stopping the extradition bill. There's a very powerful moment of identity building and nation building going on around that, and that's what made me. That's one of the moments that made me so convinced that this was what it was really about, more than just a protest movement. But you're quite right that an identity movement then begins to raise questions of who's the in-group and who's the out-group. And unfortunately, that has then led to degrees of xenophobia among the protest movement, and certainly some aspects of the localist wing of the protest movement are seen as being overly sympathetic to other right-wing movements around the world. And it does lead to complicated issues, in particular in Hong Kong, which is a multicultural city with people from around the world, and of course has many people from the rest of China who live here and work here and feel just as much a part of Hong Kong as the people who were born and brought up here. I mean, interestingly, even some of the leaders of that movement themselves were born on the mainland and grew up here. People such as Edward Leung, he was born in Wuhan, I believe, and came to Hong Kong as a child. So it does lead to complicated issues, which is, I think, what makes this so interesting. And again, yeah, no easy answers, but yeah, certainly it's what makes this much more complex than just a matter of the government giving a concession on a certain number of policy issues, and that would resolve the whole thing. It's much more complex than that.
We have 3 right here, so right here, then Eric, then Shabani.
Hi, thanks, Anthony. Neil Carabine is my name. When Carrie tried to bring in the extradition bill last year, as you pointed out, 1 million and then 2 million protesters, Hong Kong was alive and people were sticking up for themselves. The national security law comes along. Shortly thereafter, I think, Beijing decided that they'd Kerry wanted to postpone the election by 12 months. Beijing said, yeah, go ahead, a minimum of 12 months. It is a clear breach of the basic law, which says 4 years, full stop. No room for interpretation there. But there hasn't been a squeak of protest, and I suspect very little protest will arise after these 4 being kicked out, again, clearly in breach of the basic law. So I'm a lawyer as well, so the law kind of matters. But it would seem that the NSL has done its job. 0 protests, 0 court actions. So as disheartening as it is, the NSL has been very effective. I'd just like you to comment on that perspective.
Yeah, I agree. As a tool of fear and intimidation, it's been incredibly effective. You see that not only in the lack of protests on the streets, but the degree of self-censorship that it's given rise to. People censoring their social media accounts, stores sometimes under threat from police pulling down their linen walls. People, I mean, you feel it in discussions with people. People begin to sort of look over their shoulders or look around the restaurant before speaking on these issues, like they do in the mainland. They now do here, which they didn't do before. And people guessing at where the red lines might be, and of course the red lines being very deliberately not drawn clearly to make people moderate their own behavior. So yes, absolutely, it's been an effective tool of intimidation. I think as people get used to it, we may see people beginning to tiptoe towards the imaginary line again. But you're quite right to mention the law as well. I think that's the other byproduct of this national security law, is that it really does seriously undermine Hong Kong's rule of law. It's, as I've said before, it's basically a black hole in the middle of Hong Kong's rule of law, empowering the government or certain government agencies effectively to do whatever they want. And while businesses, and foreign businesses in particular, think that as long as they don't touch politics, it all has nothing to do with them, I think they're going to find themselves much mistaken, because they forget that in China everything is politics. And so I think there will inevitably be some rather shocked people along the way as well. But yeah, I agree with the thesis. Yeah.
Eric.
Thank you, Eric Wishart. I'll put my AFP news agency hat on. I mean, one striking thing from the protests was the number of American flags. I tweeted a story from the Hong Kong Free Press, which is still fighting its good fight, about how so many pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong were disappointed that Donald Trump lost the election. They saw him as a champion. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that. I mean, was it misguided? Was it justified? Does Donald Trump know where Hong Kong is in the map? And what can we expect from Joe Biden?
Well, I'm not a US expert, so I won't guess at what a Biden administration will bring. But no, look, it's been a controversial issue from back last year when there were American flag waving protesters. And at the time, many people, and in particular sort of foreign observers or people who are foreign people who were involved in the protest, would criticize that and say, you know, this is making you look bad in front of the rest of the world, and it looks like you're appealing to US imperialism and these kind of things. But in a way, at the time, it sort of felt like those protesters had the last laugh, because their aim in doing that was to get the attention of the US government and the White House. Indeed, pictures of Hong Kong protesters waving US flags was shown on Fox News, as good as having them standing in the Lincoln bedroom directly. And the US government followed up and enacted the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, and this year have gone further, of course, in response to the national security law. And so I think to a certain extent, many of them feel vindicated that they were looking for allies around the world who would help them to put pressure on the Chinese government, and they were successful from their point of view. Now, you know, I certainly there's an element of misguidedness there in their affection for Donald Trump and their belief that he has their interests at heart rather than his own or the US's, and without wanting to be drawn into a sort of debate on US politics. Yeah, it's clearly unseemly from the rest of the world's point of view, the way in which they've been throwing their weight into the debate of the US elections, and I've been busily muting and blocking crazies in my Twitter feed who've been espousing election conspiracy theories as a result. But yeah.
Okay, and Shabani, and this will be the last question.
Hi, Shabani with the Washington Post. So, given the space for, even peaceful protests, political debate, and all those avenues that were open to Hong Kong for so long are closing, do you expect in the coming years to actually see a more radical form of protests and things moving more into like cells? And there were long discussions on this, right, following the sort of Belfast style, way of protesting. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's certainly a worry, because it's you couldn't say that that's not foreseeable, right? It's a possibility that given all the other options closed off, people push to more and more radical means, that finds its expression in real terrorism, and that would be, obviously a dreadful outcome for Hong Kong. But you have to see at least that some of the elements are there, or some of the ingredients are there that could lead to that. I think that the part of what the national security law and the huge mechanism that is built up behind that is intended to sort of identify early and stop any attempts at that. And given that you have now a whole office block of people sitting in Causeway Bay whose job is to do that, I think they're going to find it whether it's there or not, in a way, because they've got a job to do, and KPIs to meet. Look, yeah, but certainly it's a worry. But the question, of course, is what are the other alternatives to that? I still see Hong Kong's civil society as being very strong and very healthy. Notwithstanding government attempts to shut it down, I expect there'll be sort of new and creative ways that people find to express themselves. The question is really, will that be allowed to have any influence ultimately in the system? Because it seems that Beijing's aim is that there'll be no avenue or no opportunity for influence except through their approved channels. And it's a disappointing and sort of depressing outcome for a place that is so vibrant and has so many, such an active grassroots civil society and community that want to be engaged and want to be involved in the future of their city. And I hope that for Hong Kong's sake, the people of Hong Kong's sake, that they find an avenue to do that, or they're allowed to have an avenue to do that in the future.
I'm going to let one more question over here.
Hi, Gilliam Hamilton, GavCal Research. Early on in the protests, state media, mainland state media, pushed the narrative that the protesters were not just misguided, they were suffering from systemic inequality. And these are kids with no future, and Hong Kong is being raided by fat cat capitalists. They pointed specifically to property developers, as well as the great taipans. And there was murmuring that these guys would be slowly replaced with more patriotic Chinese SOEs. This narrative then faded quickly when the protesters themselves were more strongly vilified. But my question is, now that the waters have calmed a bit, do you think that Beijing, especially given Xi Jinping's priority of poverty alleviation, will try to reform the systemic, who is owning Hong Kong, or are they going to go back to taking a more hands-off approach outside of politics?
I think given the broader developments happening at the central level in China, I think a reshaping along the lines that you suggest towards more red capital influence in Hong Kong, the replacement ultimately over time of the tycoons with state-owned groups is likely. I don't think that's because they want to mollify the protesters in any way or change any of those systemic social inequality issues in Hong Kong, but just because they want more control over Hong Kong and the Hong Kong economy, and they want to maintain their influence. And I doubt that there are going to be any significant changes to the way social inequality in Hong Kong is addressed. I mean, I think that the bigger plan obviously is the Greater Bay Area and the ultimate integration of Hong Kong somehow into that bigger picture, and whether as part of that there is some change to the social contract or the way that people's livelihood can be addressed or cost of living can be addressed by changing the territory physically. But that's something I think for a little bit further down the road. Yeah.
Well, please join me in thanking Anthony for being here today.
Thank you.
And for his views. And we have some FCC parting gifts. Thank you all, and please sign up for our future events and look for more on Zoom as well. Thank you.